Nora Hale had never been the kind of person who chased big dreams. She did not want to be famous. She did not want her name on a building or her face on a magazine. She just wanted to help people. That was it. That had always been it. So when the letter arrived at her small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday morning in late October, she read it 3 times before she believed it. She had been selected. Out of thousands of applicants from across the country, she, Nora Hale, a 23-year-old pre-medicine student with a second-hand backpack and a first aid kit she carried everywhere, had been chosen to study at the Valcor Orbital Institute. It was a space station, a real one, orbiting a gas giant called Cathara, in a star system so far from Earth that the number of light years involved meant nothing to her brain when she tried to think about it. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time after reading the letter. Then she called her mother. Her mother cried. Nora did not cry. She made a list. The Interstellar Academic Accord had existed for 9 years. It was a formal agreement between Earth and a collection of alien civilizations, signed after decades of careful, slow, and often painful diplomacy. The idea was simple on paper. Students from different species would attend each other's schools. They would learn together. They would understand each other better. It sounded easy. It was not easy, but it was moving forward, one semester at a time. Every cycle, a small group of human students was chosen to leave Earth and study aboard the Institute. It was considered a great honor. It was also considered by many people who had done it before to be one of the loneliest and most difficult experiences of their lives. The alien students were not cruel. They were just distant. They did not know what to do with humans. They had read about them, studied their biology, reviewed their history, and then arrived at a general conclusion that humans were fragile, emotional, short-lived, and not particularly impressive on a galactic scale. Nora had read all of this in the preparatory briefing documents. She had noted it, filed it, and moved on. She was joined by 3 other humans. Cole Patton was a tall, easygoing physics graduate student from Austin, Texas, who had a habit of cracking jokes at the wrong moment and somehow making them land anyway. Lauren Grady was a linguistics researcher from Portland who had already learned the basics of 2 alien languages before the ship even departed. Derek Osey was an engineering student from Atlanta, quiet and precise, the kind of person who noticed things others missed and said nothing about them until the exact right moment. The 4 of them met in person for the first time at the departure facility in New Mexico, a wide, flat complex in the desert where the transport ships came and went every few weeks. They shook hands, exchanged nervous smiles, and boarded the ship together. None of them said much during the first few hours of travel. They all had the same expression, a kind of wide-eyed, controlled shock at the fact that they were actually doing this. The journey to the Institute took 11 days aboard a Valcor transit vessel. It was clean, quiet, and very cold by human standards. And the Valcor crew was polite. They answered questions. They did not start conversations. The food provided for the human passengers was technically correct. It met all nutritional requirements, and tasted like almost nothing at all. Cole said it tasted like someone described food to a machine that had never eaten. Nora thought that was about right. The first view of the Institute came on the 9th day, when the ship cleared the outer ring of debris that circled Cathara. The station was enormous. It was shaped like a ring, a perfect circle suspended in space, slowly rotating, with the amber and gold clouds of the gas giant filling the space behind it like a painting that was too big for any wall. Lights moved along its outer edges. Smaller ships drifted around it like leaves around a drain. None of the 4 humans said anything for almost a full minute. Then Cole said, very quietly, "Okay, that's real." They docked at the human arrival bay, and which was separated from the main arrival areas. A Valcor staff member met them, young, formal, and efficient, and walked them through a series of long corridors to their assigned dormitory wing. The corridors were high and wide and made of a dark stone called Verath, which was streaked through with thin lines of gold that caught the light and glowed faintly. It was beautiful. It also made the whole station feel very old and very serious, and not particularly interested in making anyone feel at home. Their dormitory wing was comfortable. It was also clearly separate from the rest of the student housing. The air filtration was adjusted for human lungs. The lighting was set to a spectrum closer to Earth's sun. The meal station outside their rooms offered food that actually had flavor. All of it had been arranged carefully, thoughtfully, and with a kind of precise professionalism that felt more like management than welcome. On the first full day, they attended an orientation session. The room was large and already half full of alien students from a dozen species when they arrived. The Viel Corps students were the most numerous. Tall, gray-skinned with wide amber eyes and long, four-fingered hands. They wore deep blue academic robes with silver trim. They sat straight and still and watched the four humans find their seats with expressions that were hard to read. Not mean, not warm, just watching. Yenora found her seat, set her bag down, and looked around the room slowly and carefully, the way she always did when she entered a new space. She noticed which alien students glanced away when she looked at them. She noticed which ones held her gaze for a moment, curious. She noticed that no one smiled at her, but also that no one made a face. She could work with neutral. Classes started the following morning. The subjects were advanced: theoretical xenobiology, comparative physics, interspecies diplomacy studies, and a shared language seminar that met 3 times a week. The human students were placed in sections with alien peers, which was clearly intentional. The idea was integration. In practice, during the first week, it looked more like 2 separate groups existing in the same room and occasionally passing notes. The Valcor students were sharp. They were precise. They asked questions that cut straight to the center of a problem with no extra words around them. Thus, when a professor posed a question, 3 or 4 hands went up immediately, and the answers were almost always correct. When Nora answered a question in xenobiology, correctly, and in more practical detail than the professor had expected, there was a brief silence. Then the professor moved on. 2 Valcor students in the row ahead of her glanced back for just a second. She noticed that, too. By the end of the second week, the pattern was clear. And the alien students were not going to be unfriendly. They were just going to take their time deciding what to think. Nora understood that. She was the same way about most things. She went back to her room each evening, reviewed her notes, ate her dinner, and kept her first aid kit on the shelf above her bunk where she could always see it. She had packed it herself before leaving Earth, the same way she always packed it. Suture needles, antiseptic swabs, gauze pads, closure strips, gloves, a surgical tape, a small pair of scissors, and a tube of antibacterial gel. Standard, simple, everything she might need. She had no way of knowing at that point that the kit was going to matter more than anything else she had brought with her. But it was going to matter very, very soon. 6 weeks into the semester, the Institute began preparing for the annual Convergence Summit. Nora heard about it first from Lauren, and who had picked up enough of the common tongue to follow staff conversations in the corridors. Then she read about it in the student bulletin that came through on her tablet every morning. The summit was the biggest event of the academic cycle. It happened once a year, always at the Institute, and it brought together the formal delegation heads of every species enrolled under the Interstellar Academic Accord. They gathered in the Institute's Grand Convergence Hall, stood before each other, made speeches, signed documents, and reaffirmed the values that held the whole agreement together. It was ceremonial. It was symbolic. And according to everything Nora read, it was taken with enormous seriousness by every species involved. The Valcor, in particular, treated the summit the way some people on Earth treated a sacred event. The preparation started 2 weeks early. Staff moved through the corridors with extra purpose. Student common areas were rearranged. And the Grand Convergence Hall, which sat at the very center of the station's inner ring, was closed for deep cleaning and decoration. You could feel the shift in the station's atmosphere the way you feel the air change before a storm. Cole called it Space Prom on the third day of preparations. Derek told him to stop. Lauren ignored them both and took notes on the ceremonial customs she was observing. Nora just watched and kept her thoughts to herself. At the Valcor High Overseer was a man named Drenval. Nora had not seen him in person before the summit, only in the official portrait that hung in the entry corridor of the administrative wing, a formal image of a tall, elder Valcor with silver markings along his jaw and an expression that suggested he had been solving difficult problems since before most people currently alive had been born. He was 81 years old by Valcor counting, which translated to something well past a century in Earth years. He had been one of the original architects of the Accord. He had spent decades building the agreement that allowed Nora to be sitting in a classroom on this station at all. He was also, by every account, not particularly in favor of the Human Inclusion Clause. He had signed it, he honored it, but he had made clear in diplomatic language that left no room for misunderstanding that he considered humans to be an unproven quantity, not dangerous, not threatening, just unready. Not yet at the level where they belonged in a setting this serious. Nora had read that too. She had noted it, filed it, and moved on. The day of the summit arrived on a station morning when Cathara's amber light was especially strong through the outer observation panels, filling the corridors with a warm gold color that made everything look more important than usual. The students from every species moved through the halls in their formal academic attire. The Valcor wore deep ceremonial robes of blue and silver. Other species wore their own versions of formal dress, and the result in the corridors was a slow, colorful river of beings heading toward the center of the station. The 4 human students had been given access to one of the elevated observation galleries above the Grand Convergence Hall. But they were not part of the formal proceedings. Humans were not yet represented at the delegation level. But they had the right to observe. Nora dressed in the cleanest version of the human academic uniform she had been given, a dark blue jacket and trousers with a small Earth emblem on the lapel. She clipped her name badge on. She picked up her bag. Then she picked up her first aid kit and put it in the bag as well. She did this without thinking about it, and the way some people check for their keys before leaving a room. The Grand Convergence Hall was extraordinary. Nora had passed its sealed doors during the 6 weeks of her semester, but she had never seen it open before. When they entered the gallery and looked down, she stopped walking for a moment and just looked. The hall was enormous and high. The ceiling was a dome of clear alloy, and through it, the full body of Cathara was visible, massive, ringed, amber and gold, and hanging in black space like something that should not exist, but did. The light it cast came down through the dome in wide, slow columns and landed on the floor below, which was made of dark Varath stone threaded with gold lines that caught the light and scattered it in every direction. Along the walls, carved panels reached from floor to ceiling, depicting scenes from the history of the Accord. At the far end, a wide ceremonial staircase descended from the upper entrance to the main floor, as its steps broad and low, its railing carved from the same dark stone. Around the hall on the main floor, delegation tables were arranged in a wide arc. Each table bore the symbol of a different species. Staff members in formal dress moved between them with quiet efficiency. The atmosphere was very still. The observation galleries ran along the upper ring of the hall like a balcony, and they were already full of students. Nora, Cole, Lauren, and Derek found their section and stood together near the front rail. Around them, alien students stood in neat groups, speaking in low voices, watching the floor below. A Valcor student standing near Nora glanced at her bag. He said nothing, He looked back at the hall. The formal procession began on time. One by one, the delegation heads entered from the upper entrance at the top of the grand staircase, descended to the main floor, and took their places at their respective tables. Each entrance was announced in the common tongue, and each delegation head was received with a formal gesture from the assembled observers, a specific motion of the hands that served as acknowledgement across species. The hall was patient and precise. Nothing hurried. Everything in its correct order. Drainval entered last, as was the custom for the host species. He appeared at the top of the staircase in full ceremonial robes, deep blue, silver-edged, and with the High Overseer's formal medallion at his collar. He was even taller than his portrait suggested. He moved the way very senior people sometimes move, not slowly exactly, but with a kind of weight, as if each step had been considered and approved before it was taken. He began his descent. The hall was perfectly quiet. He was 3 steps from the bottom when it happened. The Vareth tile at the base of the staircase had developed a fracture over the previous 2 days. The fracture was invisible on the surface. No one had detected it. No one had thought to check. Nothing like this had ever happened at a summit before. The stone had been in place for decades. It was simply, quietly, past the point where it could hold. It gave way under Drainval's foot. It was not a dramatic collapse. The tile shifted and cracked, not disappeared. But the edge of the broken stone was sharp, and as his foot went through, it opened a clean, but deep gash across his lower shin before he caught himself on the railing with both hands. He stopped. He did not fall. He stood very still on the remaining steps, one hand gripping the railing, his expression controlled and completely unreadable. But the wound was visible. Dark blood, deep violet, almost purple, was already spreading down his shin and soaking into the hem of his ceremonial robe. It moved quickly, the way deep wounds do. The hall went silent in the way that is different from the silence of ceremony. It was the silence of hundreds of people seeing something go wrong and not knowing what to do about it. On the far side of the hall, the summit's assigned medical aide began moving immediately. He was good at his job. He was also on the opposite side of a very large room, separated from the staircase by the full width of the ceremonial floor, with delegation tables and formal barriers in between. He moved, but he was far away. The Veilcore attendants who stood nearer to Drainval were frozen in a different way. Touching the High Overseer without formal permission during a public ceremonial event was a serious breach of protocol. Their instinct, deeply trained, was to wait for the sanctioned aid. They stood close and did not move. Drainval stood at the base of the staircase, one hand on the railing, and bled onto the floor of the grand convergence hall in front of every delegation in the room. But up in the gallery, Nora Hale had already unzipped her bag. Cole saw her reach into the bag and he understood what she was doing before she said anything. He put his hand on her arm, not to stop her, but just to pause her for 1 second. "Nora," he said very quietly. "He is bleeding, Cole," she said. That was all she said. She looked at him for just 1 moment, calm and clear, and then she was moving. She was not running. She was walking fast. The kind of walking that covers ground quickly without drawing extra attention to itself. She had the first aid kit out of her bag and in her hand before she reached the gallery stairs. She went down 2 steps at a time, turned at the bottom, and pushed into the main corridor that ran behind the gallery level. She found the side door to the hall floor, pushed through it, and stepped into the grand convergence hall. The ceremonial barriers were low rope lines on stands, and arranged to keep the procession routes clean and orderly. Nora stepped over the first one without slowing down. She moved around the edge of a delegation table, went past 2 Veilcore staff members who turned and looked at her with expressions of open confusion, and reached the base of the staircase in just under a minute from the moment she had started moving. She was breathing normally. The Veilcore attendants near Drainval moved to block her. One of them stepped directly in front of her and extended a hand. He was taller than her by a full head and a half, and his expression was firm. He said something in Valcor that no translator rendered, probably something that meant stop, or you are not allowed here, or both. Nora looked up at him. She held up the first aid kit clearly so he could see it. Her voice was calm and loud enough to carry. "I am a pre-medicine student from Earth," she said. "He is bleeding from a deep wound. I have the tools to close it. Please let me help him." The attendant did not move. There was a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5, where nothing happened. The hall was completely still. Hundreds of beings in the gallery above and on the floor below were watching a small human woman in a dark blue jacket standing at the base of a ceremonial staircase, holding a small canvas kit, looking up at an attendant 3 times her width. Then Draenval spoke. His voice was steady. It gave nothing away. If he was in pain, it did not reach his voice. He said 2 words in the common tongue. "Let her." The attendant stepped aside. Nora moved past him without hesitation. She reached Draenval, looked up at him for 1 second to confirm he was stable on his feet, and then she went down to 1 knee on the Varoth floor and looked at the wound. It was a clean cut, long. She estimated about 11 centimeters when she gently moved the hem of his robe to see the full length. The edges were sharp and close, which was good. It was deep enough to need closure, but she could see it had not gone past the outer tissue layers. The bleeding was real and fast, but it was not the kind of bleeding that meant something critical had been hit. She knew the difference. She had been studying the difference for years. She pulled on her gloves. They snapped at her wrists with a clean, sharp sound that seemed very loud in the silence. "This is going to feel cold," she said to the floor, not looking up, already opening the antiseptic swab. "I am going to clean the wound first, then I am going to close it with stitches. You will feel pressure. It should not be too painful. If at any point you cannot tolerate it, say so, and I will stop." She did not ask if that was acceptable. She just told him what she was going to do and waited for half a second in case he stopped her. He did not stop her. She applied the antiseptic, and it was cold, and she had warned him, and he did not react. She cleaned the wound quickly and carefully, checking the edges, checking the depth as best she could with her gloved fingers. The violet blood kept coming, and she let it, because you clean before you close. She blotted it away with gauze and looked again. Then she reached for the suture needle. It was a small, curved needle, the kind used in basic field medicine, the kind that had been used on Earth for a very long time. It was threaded with suture material, dark and thin. She held it up for a moment, checked it in the light, and then she began. The first stitch went in close to the top of the wound. She placed it the way her professor had showed her, the way she had practiced on mannequin skin and pig skin and dozens of lab exercises over 2 years. In on one side, through, out on the other, tied off with the correct tension. Not too tight, not too loose, and enough to hold the edges together cleanly so the tissue could heal underneath. She moved to the second stitch, then the third. She was not thinking about the hundreds of eyes above her. She was not thinking about the alien delegation heads at their tables, watching. She was not thinking about the fact that this was the high overseer of the Valcor academic institution, the man who had helped build the accord that had brought her here. She was thinking about the wound, just the wound. About the edges, the depth, the spacing of the stitches, the tension of each tie. Everything else was background. Draenval stood completely still. He looked down at her while she worked, this young human woman on one knee on the floor of his hall, bent over his leg with a needle in her hand, moving with quiet, focused precision. He could not see her face, only the top of her head, her loose braid, the steady movement of her hands. She was not nervous. He could tell. He had spent a very long life learning to read the body language of many species, and she was not nervous. She was simply working. That was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. In the gallery above, Lauren had stopped breathing. She realized it when Cole gently touched her shoulder and she gasped. The alien students around them had gone completely still, not restless, not anxious. Still in the way of people who are watching something they do not fully understand yet, but cannot look away from. A young Velcor student standing 2 places away from Derek had his eyes fixed on the floor below and his head tilted slightly to the side, the way his species indicated confusion, combined with deep attention. He watched Nora's hands move. He watched the needle go in and come out, and the stitch hold. He watched her move down the wound, steady and even, 1 stitch at a time. But he had never seen anything like it. None of them had. Nora placed the 9th stitch, then the 10th. She examined the gap that remained, judged the spacing, and placed the 11th stitch at the bottom of the wound, bringing the last edges of the cut cleanly together. She tied it off. She sat back on her heel for a moment and looked at the whole line from top to bottom. It was clean, even, good. She cleaned the area 1 more time with a fresh swab, and then pressed a line of thin closure strips along the suture line. Extra support, extra protection. She laid a clean gauze pad over the whole thing and held it in place with 2 strips of surgical tape. Then she looked up. Drainval was looking down at her. His expression was still controlled. But something in his wide amber eyes had shifted, just slightly, in a way she could not put a name to. "The wound is closed," she said. 11 stitches. The bleeding is controlled. You need proper medical care in the next few hours, a full assessment, and a proper dressing. But you are stable right now." She paused, then added, "You should also have someone look at that staircase." There was a silence, and then, very quietly, from somewhere up in the gallery, 1 single sound, a low, resonant hum. Just 1 voice, for just a second. Then it stopped. Nora peeled off her gloves, folded them, and placed them in her kit. She closed the kit. She stood up. She picked up her bag and stepped back 1 step to give the approaching medical aid room to work. She had been at the floor of that staircase for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The Vilecore medical aid reached Drainval about 3 minutes after Nora had finished. He was a senior medical professional, and he moved with calm efficiency. He knelt, examined the wound, checked the stitches 1 by 1 with careful fingers, and then looked up at Drainval and spoke in their language. Nora did not understand what he said, but Drainval listened, gave a single, slow nod, and the aide stood and called for a support panel to be brought. Before he was moved to the medical wing, Drainval turned his head and looked for Nora. She was standing back near the edge of the floor, her bag over her shoulder, her kit in her hand, watching. When his eyes found her, he said nothing. He simply held her gaze for a moment and then gave 1 small, deliberate nod. Nora nodded back. But the summit resumed 22 minutes later. A formal announcement was made that the High Overseer had received treatment and was stable. His address would continue as planned. The hall rearranged itself. Barriers were moved, the delegation tables were adjusted, and the broken tile at the base of the staircase was covered with a flat panel. Staff moved through the space with quick, quiet purpose. When Drainval returned to the hall, he was walking without assistance. And he wore the same ceremonial robe, not a replacement, the same one, with the dark violet stain still visible along the hem where the blood had soaked in. Whether this was intentional or simply practical, no one said, but everyone noticed. He stood at the front of the hall and delivered the address. His voice was measured and clear. He spoke about the meaning of the accord, about the courage required to reach across the space between different kinds of minds and choose to learn from each other. And he spoke about the long work of trust, and how it is built not in formal ceremonies but in small moments that are not planned or expected. No one in the hall moved while he spoke. In the observation gallery, Nora stood between Cole and Derek and watched. Cole was quiet, which was unusual. Derek had his arms folded and was looking at the floor below with an expression that was hard to read, something between proud and stunned. Lauren had her small notebook in her hands, but she was not writing in it. Around the 4 humans, the alien student body had shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no moment where someone stood up and made a speech. It was quieter than that and, in some ways, more powerful. The alien students were simply different. The low hum of conversation that usually moved through the galleries during any event was gone. People were looking at the humans more directly than they had in 6 weeks. Not with the old expression, the one that said, "You are an interesting curiosity," with something else, something that had more thought behind it. The young Velcor student who had been standing near Derek during the summit, a second year named Ethan, sharp-faced and quietly intense, made his way over to Lauren as the hall began to empty after the address. He stood beside her for a moment before he spoke. He had a habit of thinking before he said things, and Lauren had already noticed this about him from their shared seminar class. "The instrument she used," he said, gesturing very slightly toward Nora, who was ahead of them moving toward the exit. "The one with the needle. What is that called?" Lauren looked at him. "A suture kit," she said, "for closing wounds." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You close wounds with a needle? The way you close fabric?" "Essentially, yes," Lauren said. "It is one of the oldest medical techniques humans use." He looked at Nora's back for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "How old?" "Thousands of years," Lauren said. "The basic concept goes back to the earliest human civilizations we have records of." Ethan turned to the 2 Velcor students beside him and spoke rapidly in their language. They responded with equal speed. Then all 3 of them looked back at Nora and then at Lauren, and Ethan said, "We do not have an equivalent. When our tissue is damaged at that level, we use biochemical sealant technology. It was developed 400 years ago. Before that, wounds of that kind were a significant cause of death." He paused. "You have been doing this for thousands of years with a needle." "Yes," Lauren said. Ethan looked like a person who had just been handed a piece of information that required a great deal of rearranging of other information to fit. He did not say anything else. He just nodded slowly and walked away, still thinking. By the following morning, the story was everywhere. The way stories spread in a closed community, a space station where a few thousand students lived and ate and studied together, is fast and total. There is no outside. There is nowhere for the story to go except through every corridor and common room and dining area and classroom. By breakfast, every student on the station knew what had happened at the summit. By midday, the version circulating included details that were accurate, details that were exaggerated, and one detail that was completely invented, that Nora had performed the stitches while carrying on a normal conversation. She had not. But it said something about the mood that people wanted to believe she had. The change in how the alien students treated the 4 humans was not a complete transformation. It was not as if doors suddenly flew open and everyone became best friends overnight. It was more like a wall that had been there became a little thinner. Students who had previously walked past them in corridors without acknowledgement now made brief eye contact. In seminars, questions were directed at them more often. In the common dining areas, beings who had previously chosen the furthest available seats from the human table now sometimes sat 1 or 2 tables closer. It was not much, but it was real, and they could all feel it. 3 days after the summit, an Velcor second-year medical student named Orev sent Nora a formal message through the academic communication system. He wrote in the common tongue, carefully and politely, explaining that a group of second-year medical students had been discussing human wound closure techniques and would like to understand more. He asked if she would be willing to speak with them informally. He suggested the small seminar room near the biology wing at a time that suited her schedule, and he attached a list of questions. There were 14 of them. Nora read the message twice. Then she replied and said yes. Cole was in the room when she got the message, and she read parts of it out loud to him. He listened, then leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "You know what is happening, right?" he said. "People want to ask about stitches," she said. "People," Cole said. "Are trying to figure out what to do with the fact that a human girl fixed the most important alien on this station with a kit she bought at a medical supply store and carries around in her bag because she just does that." Nora thought about this for a moment. "It is a good kit," she said. Cole laughed. She smiled, and for the first time since they had arrived, the sound of a genuine laugh in their small dormitory corridor did not feel out of place at all. And the seminar with the medical students was scheduled for the following week. By the time it arrived, the original group of 7 had grown to 31. Nora stood at the front of a seminar room with a whiteboard behind her, and 30 alien students sitting in rows in front of her with notebooks and tablets ready, and she began to talk about the history of suturing, the way she always approached difficult things. From the beginning, simply, with no words wasted. And she explained where the technique came from. She explained how it had developed over centuries. She showed them the needle and the thread. She explained the mechanics, why the curved needle, why interrupted stitches, why tension matters, why antiseptic comes first. She answered every question on Orev's list and several that arose during the session that no one had thought to write down beforehand. And the room was completely silent the whole time, except for her voice and the scratch of pens on paper. When she finished, no one moved for a moment. Then a student near the back raised her hand and asked, very carefully, "Your bodies are so easily damaged. How did your species survive long enough to develop this?" Nora considered the question. "We kept learning how to fix what broke," she said. "Every time something went wrong, we studied it and found a way to do better next time. We have been doing that for as long as we have existed." The student wrote this down. So did everyone else in the room. The message from Drainval arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days before the end of the semester. It came through the official academic channel, marked with the High Overseer's formal seal, a small emblem of 2 intersecting rings that Nora had seen on official institute documents but never received personally. The message was short. It said that the High Overseer requested a meeting with student Nora Hale of the Earth delegation at her earliest convenience, in his office on the upper tier of the administrative wing. She showed it to Cole, who read it twice, and then said, "I think that is the alien version of being called to the principal's office, except the principal respects you." She put on her cleanest uniform jacket and went. The administrative wing was on the top level of the inner ring. Now, the corridors up there were quieter and wider than the student sections. The Varath walls here were darker, the gold threads in the stone thicker. The lighting was lower. Everything had the feeling of a place where serious things were decided by serious people who had been doing serious things for a very long time. Drainval's office was at the end of the main corridor. The door was open when she arrived. She knocked on the frame anyway. He was standing at the window. The window took up most of the far wall and looked directly out at Cathara. The gas giant filled the view completely, amber and gold and ringed and enormous, drifting in the black the way only something truly massive can drift, with a slowness that felt almost gentle. He turned when she knocked. "Nora Hale," he said. "Please sit." She sat in the chair across the desk. The desk was made of Varath stone, polished smooth, with a few small items arranged on it. A document tablet, a closed case, a single object she did not recognize. He sat across from her. She noticed that he was sitting comfortably and moving his leg without any visible difficulty. The wound had healed well, apparently. He studied her for a moment before he spoke. It was the same kind of careful attention she had noticed in his expression at the summit, the look of someone measuring something precisely. "I am told," he said, That when the Institute staff attempted to formally acknowledge your actions at the summit, you declined. I did not need acknowledgement, she said. You were injured, and I had the tools to help. That is all it was. I see, he said. He was quiet for a moment. In 81 years, no person has ever knelt at my feet to assist me without first asking permission, checking protocol, or waiting for a signal from a superior. Every being who might have helped that day chose to wait. You did not wait. Waiting was not going to help the wound, she said. Something moved in his expression. It was very small and very brief. In a human face, it might have been a smile. In his, it was something more contained, a slight shift around the eyes, a fractional easing of the lines around his mouth. It was there for just a second, and then it was gone, replaced again by the same quiet control he seemed to wear like a second robe. No, he said. It was not. He placed his hands flat on the desk. I want to tell you about several decisions that have been made by the Academic Council over the past week and a half. You did not cause these decisions by yourself, but what happened at the summit moved things that had not been moving for a long time. He told her the first thing. The human delegation quota for the following academic cycle had been voted on and approved unanimously by the full Academic Council, and it was being expanded from 4 seats to 12. The expansion had been in formal discussion for 3 years. It had been blocked each time by a procedural hesitation that was, in practice, a cultural one. The council had members who did not feel the evidence was there to justify it. After the summit, that argument had lost the support it needed to continue holding. Nora listened without expression. He told her the second thing. Thus, a student petition had been submitted to the Academic Council requesting that basic human first aid principles, wound assessment, triage, manual wound closure techniques be added to the mandatory first-year curriculum for all enrolled species. The petition had 347 signatures. It had been submitted 4 days after the summit. The student who had written and organized it was Ethan. The petition had been accepted. Nora sat very still. Ethan wrote in his petition, Drainval said, that any civilization which chose to learn to repair its own physical damage with a needle rather than accept the wound as a defeat had earned the right to be studied carefully. He paused. He is not wrong. It took me some time to reach that conclusion for myself. But I have reached it. Nora looked at the window, at Cathara, at the rings moving through the dark. We did not invent stitches because we were brave, she said. We invented them because we kept getting hurt, and we did not want to die from it. We just kept finding ways to not die. Yes, Drainval said. That is what I mean. She looked back at him. For many centuries, he continued, the civilizations in this part of the galaxy have measured the quality of a species by what technology it possesses. How advanced is its energy system? How efficient is its travel? How sophisticated is its biology? And we looked at humans, and we saw a species that was behind in almost every one of those categories. He paused. We did not think to ask what you had learned by surviving with less. Nora said nothing. She waited. You carry a small bag, he said. In that bag is a needle. You have carried tools like that needle for thousands of years, through every difficulty your species has faced, because your bodies break, and you decided, very early and very firmly, that breaking was not the end, and that is not a primitive quality. He looked at her directly. That is one of the most advanced things I have ever encountered. She did not know what to say to that. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, I am glad I could help. He nodded. So am I. He told her one more thing before she left. The broken tile at the base of the ceremonial staircase had been replaced, but one piece of the original stone, a small fragment about the size of a palm, had been kept. It was going to be mounted in the entry corridor of the medical wing with a small plaque beneath it. The plaque would not mention the summit by name. It would just carry a line in the common tongue that translated roughly as, "A wound is not a defeat. It is a problem waiting to be solved." Ethan had suggested the wording. Nora left the administrative wing and walked back through the station toward the student quarters. And the corridors were full at that time of day, the midday break between morning and afternoon classes, and the halls were busy with students from a dozen species moving in every direction. She walked through them, her bag on her shoulder, thinking. She had 3 days left on the station. 3 days before the departure ship arrived and the 4 of them went home. She thought about Columbus, and she thought about her small apartment and her mother and the medical school application she had to finish when she got back. She thought about the first aid kit on the shelf above her bunk and how it had been there every morning when she woke up and every night when she went to sleep, and she had never once thought it would matter this much. On the last morning, the departure bay was on the inner ring, lower level. Nora, Cole, Lauren, and Derek arrived with their bags. The ship was already there, a transport vessel, loading quietly. They checked in with the departure staff member, a young Velcor woman who was professional and efficient, and also, Nora noticed, slightly less cool than the staff had been when they arrived. She smiled when she handed back the departure clearance, a small smile. Real. They walked into the departure corridor. It was lined on both sides. Hundreds of students filled both sides of the corridor, standing in rows that stretched back as far as she could see. Species she had shared classes with, species she had only seen from across the dining hall, Velcor students in their blue robes, others in their own dress, their own colors. They were standing quietly, watching the 4 humans walk. Then Ethan, standing near the front of the line on the left side, tilted his head back and began to hum. It was low and resonant and warm, the Velcor sound of formal, on deep respect, the sound she had heard for just 1 second after she had finished the stitches. Other Velcor students joined immediately. Then others who did not hum raised their hands, or stamped their feet, or vibrated the resonance frills along their necks, or made whatever sound their species made when they wanted to say something that words were not enough for. The corridor filled with sound. It was not loud the way a human crowd is loud, and it was layered, low and high and humming and drumming and ringing, and it came from every direction, and it was unmistakably, completely for them. Nora stopped walking. Cole stopped beside her. Lauren put her hand over her mouth. Derek stood very straight and stared ahead and blinked several times. Nora looked at all of them, the faces she had spent a semester learning. The students who had watched her with distance and skepticism, and then with something different, something that had changed shape slowly, and then all at once. She looked at Ethan, who was still humming, and whose expression, for the first time since she had met him, was fully open. Cole leaned over and said quietly, close to her ear, "They are rejoicing, Nora." She felt it move through her. Not in her chest, exactly, but somewhere deeper. The feeling of being seen. Not as a species that was behind or fragile or unready. As something else entirely. As people who carried their needles with them across the universe and used them when someone was bleeding, without waiting for permission or a signal or a better moment. She picked up her bag. She straightened her braid. She smiled. Wide and real, and without any performance behind it at all. "Yeah," she said. "I know." She walked forward through the sound, into the light of the departure bay, and for the first time since she had left Earth, she did not feel far from home at all.